All right, so picking up after some of the Renaissance artists, finishing out with Titian and his use of color and the Renaissance arts and the changes they have made, we need to talk about a reaction against the Renaissance ideals of balance and symmetry and simplicity and realistic use of color. Just as we talked about the High Renaissance's reaction to the early Renaissance and going to emotional, too human, and not was still with enough religious vigor for the High Renaissance painters. Leonardo stepping in and saying, "No, you can have both." Well, Mannerism is the reaction to the High Renaissance, and a reaction against the ideals of balance and symmetry, simplicity, and realistic use of color. The High Renaissance had taken art to perfection. There was little that could be done to improve it. Leonardo had stepped in there and finished what the early Renaissance painters had started. And so thus, if you can't beat it, rebel against it. So the Mannerists rebelled against it. Works often used unnatural colors, while shapes were elongated or otherwise exaggerated or kind of twisted and distorted here. Tintoretto, which is a Venetian painter, will use elongated figure proportions, twisted poses, unnatural poses, and compression of space or tightening of space. We also have El Greco, who was a Greek artist who did most of his great work in Spain. He's perhaps the greatest of the Mannerists with his use of elongated figures and unnatural pigments, off skin colors. So really going against that realistic use of color, rebelling against High Renaissance perfection. The burial of Count Orgaz and Toledo are two of the most important examples of his work. Here you can see the burial of the Count. That's this work. That is right here, and the offset skin colors, elongated bodies, twisted unnatural poses, all of these things that will become characteristics of Mannerism. So again, cause and effect. The effect the early Renaissance had for the changes in the High Renaissance, and then the perfection and beauty of the High Renaissance being reacted upon by the Mannerists that will follow. Next, we will need to address the Northern Renaissance. As we've been moving along, I have been talking each time about how the Renaissance will not just stay in Italy, that it will spread north, it'll finally spread to England, and then end in Italy with the sack of Rome in 1527. So we are ready to move to the Northern Renaissance and pick up again with our humanism. This time we need to talk about Christian humanism. You have been studying Petrarch and Mirandola and Machiavelli and all of these authors of the time, but we need to take a look at how Christian humanism, or emphasis on the early church writings that provided answers on how to improve society and reform the church, how that's going to play out now within our humanism. Christian humanism is going to put less emphasis on pagan or non-Christian works from ancient Greece and Rome, although these works were widely read and enjoyed by Christian humanists. Many historians today see more continuity between the Northern and Italian Renaissance than contrasts. So Christian humanism going to be begun in the Northern Renaissance. It will draw on Hebrew and Greek texts of the Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers. It's going to emphasize education and power of human intellect to bring about institutional change and moral improvement. The writings will lead to criticism of the church, thus leading to the Reformation. So this is a really important part here. Want to make sure that you're understanding that all of these little changes, the shift from just humanism and the hearkening of the Greek and Roman texts are now going to be less emphasis on pagan works from ancient Greece and Rome and more focus on the Hebrew and Greek text of the Bible and the writings of the church fathers. So evidently up too late. making a presentation of the Bible and the writings of the church fathers, which will lead to criticism, thus leading to the Reformation, which will be the beginning of Unit 2 for us, or the challenges to the church continuing after those latter Middle Ages. Next, we need to talk about Erasmus, and this will be someone that you will be reading pieces of works from in one of our upcoming classes this week. He's the most famous and celebrated of all of the Northern humanists. He was a master of the Greek language and one of Europe's foremost authorities on the Greek language. He made new translations of the Greek and Latin versions of the New Testament to create what he would call pure editions. He will be the first humanist to earn a living by writing, which was an extremely impressive achievement. Usually the writing of the humanists didn't pay the bills. The work that we'll be looking at and the work that I'm going to talk about here is called In Praise of Folly. It was a bestseller, and only the Bible sold more copies than In Praise of Folly by 1550. It was written in Latin, and thus it was not intended for mass consumption. Remember, most people could not read Latin any longer, only their common language. So by doing this, he did not intend this publication to be read by the mass population. He was a devout Catholic who wanted to reform the church, not destroy it. Okay, he wanted to reform what he thought was wrong, but not destroy it. He satirized people's worldly ambitions, including the clergy. So he uses satire to criticize. He will criticize immorality and hypocrisy of church leaders and the clergy. This book, will inspire renewed calls for reform. And the call for reform that we're going to be most impacted by here is the influence that it had on Martin Luther. Thus, some contemporaries claim that Erasmus had laid the egg that Luther hatched regarding the Reformation. So some will give credit to the Reformation, more to his work, because of its vast influence on Luther. Next is Thomas More. Thomas More, we are also going to be taking a look at his work, Utopia. It's his humanist masterpiece. It's going to mix that civic humanism with religious ideals to describe a perfect utopian society located on an imaginary island. So like the perfect place, the perfect society. More sees the accumulation of property as a root cause for society's ills. A few have it and most don't. So back to wealth, desire, only focusing on what you have and what others have as the root of society's ills. He believed in order to achieve harmony and order, people have to be willing to sacrifice their individual rights for the common good. For the greater good, one must put themselves last. He also said that war, poverty, religious intolerance, and other problems of the early 16th century do not exist. Okay, so Utopia and More is going to be something we're definitely going to be exploring more in the same day with Erasmus. Both going to be very influential of where we're heading in our next unit. Jacques Lefebvre is a leading French humanist and good example of how Northern Christian humanists focused on early church writings. He is going to actually end up producing 5 versions of Psalms that changed a single authoritative version of the Bible. So he is going to give some new additions to that book of the Bible. He was also devout and later seen as an enemy of the church and condemned for heresy. So this is back to the idea that these are Christian humanists. They may be seeking changes or reform, but not to destroy the church, and still have a great faith in the church, although still promoting the potential of human beings. Francesco Cicero is the Spanish humanist who reformed the Spanish clergy and church, so that many of the church abuses that were highlighted during the Reformation did not necessarily apply to Spain. He is able to reform the church so that it will be much different than the church Martin Luther is protesting in the Reformation. The Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition serves as an example of how not all humanists were necessarily tolerant of heretical views. As we get to the Spanish Inquisition, we'll talk more about what being the Grand Inquisitor was, but for those of you who have a little background knowledge on this from world history, this is, the persecution of those who do not share the same religious views or did not share the same religious views of the Spanish, and will be persecuted for that. He is also going to be very focused on early church writings and the accuracy of biblical translations. He is going to create a Bible that places Hebrew, Greek, and Latin versions of the Bible in parallel columns, this way ensuring that there are accuracy in the translations. Rabelais is an author that we read today. Some of you had in your group or should have learned about in your group discussion of your priesthood statements. His secular writings portrayed his confidence in human nature and reflected Renaissance tastes. There were a couple pieces of his work in the primary sources today. Gargantua and Pantagruel is a folk epic and comic masterpiece that satires French society and attacked clerical education and monastic orders. You saw this in his work as he created a fake monastery to satire the church. He attacked clerical education and championed secular learning. So he's going to be a proponent of learning in the secular sense instead of the church. So if you want to take a look back at his work from your packet, we will be kind of heading in this direction. Montaigne developed the essay form and skepticism, so very important literary uses here. The essay form that he creates becomes a vehicle for testing new ideas. Also, his skepticism is the doubt that true knowledge could be obtained. He believed that the skeptic must be cautious, critical, and suspend judgment. Thus, one must be tolerant of others' views. And so both very important pieces that we'll be adding into our puzzle as we move along. Next is Mr. Willie Shakespeare, who you should be familiar with from your English classes. This is going to bring us into the Elizabethan era when we take a look at some Shakespearean work. He is the greatest of the English Renaissance authors. Remember, the Renaissance will reach England much later and be characterized by the Elizabethan era. His works reflected the Renaissance ideas of classical Greek and Roman culture, individualism and humanism, and we will see some of that as we get a chance to look at some of his comedies, tragedies, histories, and sonnets in this class. Cervantes is going to give us Don Quixote, and some of you have been exposed to this in your English class as well. It is among the greatest pieces of Spanish literature ever written. It is critical of excessive religious idealism and chivalry and romance. We will take a look at just a portion, but won't have too much time to take a look at it as in a whole for this class, although I do recommend if you can, you get a chance to look at it. That's really all I have to say on Christian humanists. We're going to pick up back in class with Northern Renaissance art and how, although different than Italian Renaissance art, also has many similarities. Renaissance in the North not having as many differences as previous historians have said that it has. We're going to take a look at how Christian humanists influenced the Northern Renaissance and how they continue to influence the Renaissance as it moves, and definitely preparing ourselves for the Reformation as we begin Unit 2 next week. So thank you for taking on 2 lectures, and we will pick back up with Northern Renaissance art and your questions, as well as some of the works of these gentlemen in class on Thursday.